Listen, you can call it a crisis, a phase, or a silent rebellion, but something is happening quietly all around you. Men are walking away, not out of hate, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. They're not fighting, they're not arguing, they're simply stepping back. And the world doesn't seem to notice. You can see it if you look closely in the way men have stopped chasing, stopped texting first, stopped planning the dates, stopped trying to fix what keeps breaking. It's not that they don't care anymore, it's that they finally realized caring too much in the wrong place can destroy you. For years, men were told they needed to do more, make more money, be more confident, communicate better, dress sharper, love harder, and they did, but somehow it was never enough. Every time they improved, the goalposts moved. Every time they gave, the gratitude disappeared. Now the same men who once dreamed about marriage, who wanted to build something real, they're sitting alone in apartments that are finally quiet. No yelling, no chaos, no confusion, just peace. And that peace? It feels better than love ever did, because modern love, at least the way it's sold, started to feel like a debt you could never pay off. A man could give his time, his effort, his loyalty, his entire heart, and still be told he's not enough. Still be compared to someone richer, taller, more exciting, more mysterious. So men stopped playing the game. They stopped auditioning for roles they never applied for. They stopped chasing people who saw them as replaceable. And something unexpected happened. When they stopped chasing, they found clarity. When they stopped proving, they found power. And when they stopped dating, they found peace. But here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Men didn't just give up on dating. They gave up on trying to be chosen. Because when every conversation feels like a test, when every relationship feels like a transaction, and when every act of love feels like a performance, the heart stops showing up. This isn't about anger, it's about realization. It's about a generation of men who looked at the modern dating market and said, no thanks, I'd rather be alone than be drained. And for the first time in decades, being alone doesn't feel like losing, it feels like winning. Section 2, the shift. When men stopped trying, it didn't happen overnight. There wasn't some mass announcement or protest. No movement, no hashtags. It happened in silence. One date, one disappointment, one she ghosted me at a time. It happened when men realized effort no longer guaranteed connection, when showing up with good intentions didn't mean anything anymore, when sincerity became invisible and games became the new language of love. You could see it in the way conversations changed. Once, dating was simple. Dinner, laughter, long drives, awkward smiles. Now it's interviews, checklists, negotiations. A man used to walk into a date hoping to meet someone kind. Now he walks in wondering what test he's about to fail. It's subtle, but it's everywhere. The casual comments about bare minimum men, the constant reminders that she deserves the best, the quiet pressure that being a good man isn't good enough unless he's exceptional. So men started stepping back, first mentally, then emotionally, then physically. You'll notice it in small ways. He stops messaging first, not because he's playing games, but because he's tired of starting conversations that go nowhere. He stops offering to plan the date because last time he did, she said she wasn't feeling it. He stops trying to impress, because every time he did, it felt like a job interview with no callback. Somewhere along the line, men stopped believing they were partners. They started feeling like applicants. And slowly, something shifted. They began to realize they didn't need to prove their worth to people who couldn't see it. They realized peace isn't found in being loved. It's found in being free from the need for approval. A man who used to check his phone every few minutes now leaves it face down while he works out, reads, cooks, builds, learns, creates. Because validation doesn't fuel him anymore. Purpose does. This isn't bitterness, it's evolution. Men have quietly adapted to rejection fatigue. They've replaced dating apps with gym memberships, late-night texts with podcasts, emotional drama with long drives and silence. And they're happier because the truth is, peace is addictive. Once a man experiences it, chaos feels unbearable. You can't shame him into coming back, can't guilt him into chasing again, can't convince him that loneliness is worse than emptiness, because he's been both, and he knows which one hurts less. Ask any man in his 30s today, and he'll tell you. He's not afraid of being single. He's afraid of losing himself trying not to be. That's the shift. That's the quiet revolution nobody talks about. It's not hate. It's not revenge. It's simply men choosing sanity over struggle. And the irony? They didn't stop dating because they stopped believing in love. They stopped because love stopped believing in them. Section 3. The disappearing value of men. When effort stopped meaning something. There was a time when effort meant everything, when showing up mattered, when doing your best counted for something. But somewhere between filtered selfies and highlight reels, effort stopped being enough. Men didn't notice it right away. They kept trying, they kept giving. They thought maybe if they worked harder they'd finally be appreciated. But instead of being seen, they were measured. A man's kindness became simper energy, his generosity expected, his loyalty taken for granted, and his silence misinterpreted as weakness. He'd open a door and she'd roll her eyes. He'd compliment her and she'd call it cringe. He'd plan a date and she'd post it online without mentioning his name. It's not that appreciation disappeared, it just stopped going both ways. Somewhere along the line, men went from providers to placeholders, useful until replaced, valuable until criticized, wanted until expected, and when men realized their effort didn't hold value anymore, they stopped offering it. They learned the hard way that love today often feels like a subscription. Pay monthly, get minimal returns, cancel any time. You see it in small details. He used to bring flowers, now he brings silence. He used to surprise her with plans, now he just asks what she wants to do and lets her decide. Because no matter what he chooses, it's probably wrong anyway. And that constant pressure to always be right, to always perform, kills something inside a man. Not his pride, not his ego, but his spirit. Men are simple in their design. They don't need luxury, validation, or endless attention. They just need to feel valued. Not for what they can buy, not for what they can fix, not for how tall or funny or confident they are, but for who they are when no one's watching. But that's the part of men that got lost. That quiet decency that once made them heroes in their own homes became invisible. Now effort has become a transaction, not a gift. The woman expects it but doesn't return it. She wants him to text first, pay first, plan first, apologize first, even when she's the one who's wrong. And slowly, men began to ask a dangerous question. What's the point? If love is just labor without reward, why volunteer for it? If giving your best only gets you blamed for not giving more, why keep giving at all? That's when they began to disappear. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. They stopped calling, stopped caring, stopped hoping, not because they stopped loving, but because they were tired of proving they were worth being loved back. You can't break a man by rejecting him. You break him by making his effort meaningless. And that's what happened. Now you'll find those same men in places where effort still matters, at the gym, in their work, in their craft, in their solitude. They pour their energy into things that won't betray them, won't belittle them, won't ask them to apologize for trying too hard. They've learned something most people don't understand until it's too late, that peace, not love, is the ultimate prize. And when you give a man peace, he'll move mountains for you. But take it away and he'll never come back. Section 4. The modern dating illusion. Why love feels like a marketplace. Love used to be about connection. Now it's about competition. Once two people met by chance, through a friend, at a coffee shop, in a quiet moment neither expected. There was curiosity, nervousness, excitement. Now, it's swiping, left, right, next. The world turned intimacy into an algorithm. Dating became digital window shopping, where people are products and everyone's a critic. You're not talking to a person anymore, you're talking to a profile, a curated, filtered, perfectly optimized highlight reel. And somewhere in that endless scroll, something human got lost. Men noticed it first, that eerie feeling that they're not connecting, they're auditioning, that their value depends on lighting, angles, and a bio clever enough to compete with 1,000 others. Every man becomes a brand, every woman becomes a consumer, and everyone ends up unsatisfied. Because no matter how many options you have, none of them feel real. You can match with 500 people, but if every connection is surface level, you're not dating, you're just collecting attention. Social media turned relationships into status symbols. Love became a performance, not a partnership. The captions got longer, but the conversations got shorter. And in this new economy of affection, men quickly realized they were at a disadvantage. The rules are uneven. A woman's attention online multiplies. Likes, comments, messages from strangers across the world. A man, he might go weeks without a single genuine message. It's not resentment, it's reality. When attention becomes currency, the ones who get less learn to stop spending it. So men stopped playing the game. They deleted the apps, stopped competing for people who only saw them as one more face in a crowd. Because after a while, being ignored hurts less than being half noticed. And when everything becomes about options, commitment starts to feel like a trap. Why choose one person when a better one might appear tomorrow? Why invest deeply when replacements are one swipe away? But here's the problem, endless choice doesn't lead to happiness. It leads to emptiness. Because when you can have anyone, you stop valuing everyone. Men saw that. They saw friends losing themselves chasing validation, spending hours trying to impress strangers who didn't care. They saw how relationships turned into negotiations. What do you bring to the table? As if love were a contract. And something inside them snapped. They realized love isn't supposed to be a business deal. It's not supposed to be a competition or a marketing campaign, or a game of who cares less, so they quit. Not out of defeat, but out of self-respect. They stopped chasing people who treated affection like attention and loyalty like weakness. They stopped mistaking availability for interest, and they started learning that solitude isn't punishment, it's recovery. Because in a world where everyone's trying to be wanted, very few are trying to be worth wanting. You can't build a relationship on likes. You can't build trust through filters. You can't build love when you're competing with fantasy. And when men realized that, they walked away. They stopped chasing illusions and started chasing peace. They stopped trying to be chosen and started choosing themselves. And the irony, that's when they finally started to heal. Because maybe the real modern love story isn't two people finding each other anymore. It's one person finally finding himself. Section 5. The peace they found. Why solitude became the new freedom. At first, being alone felt strange. The silence was heavy. The empty spaces felt louder than words. But then something unexpected happened. The silence started to feel good. The noise stopped. The tension faded. The confusion disappeared. For the first time in years, men could hear themselves think. No passive-aggressive texts. No constant guessing games. No walking on eggshells trying to say the right thing, wear the right thing, be the right thing. Just peace. And once a man tastes that kind of peace, he doesn't forget it. He wakes up when he wants to, eats what he wants, trains hard, works hard, sleeps deeply. There's no drama waiting for him on his phone, no emotional roller coaster waiting at home, no battles to fight that he didn't start. He learns that silence can be love too, self-love, because peace is more than the absence of chaos, it's the presence of control. Men started finding joy in the simplest things, cooking their own meals, taking long drives, lifting weights until the noise in their head goes quiet, building small habits that lead to big peace. They stopped searching for someone to make them happy and started becoming the reason they wake up proud. They realized they didn't need a partner to feel complete, they needed purpose. They didn't need romance to feel alive, they needed direction. And when they built those things, love stopped feeling like survival, because now, love wasn't the only thing keeping them afloat. It's not that men don't want companionship, they do, but they don't want to trade their peace for it. They don't want to lose themselves trying to make someone else feel whole. They don't want to be punished for wanting simplicity. They don't want to keep proving they're good enough to people who never look in the mirror, so they choose solitude, not as a retreat but as a foundation, a place where they can build something real, even if that something is just themselves, and you can see it on their faces, that quiet calm, that slow confidence, that steady look of someone who no longer needs validation. Men used to chase excitement, now they chase peace, and peace, ironically, makes them more attractive than anything else ever did. Because a man at peace isn't desperate. He doesn't beg, doesn't argue, doesn't chase. He simply exists, grounded, whole, untouchable. And that energy, it changes everything. Men who once felt drained now feel alive. Men who once doubted their worth now walk with quiet certainty. Men who once sought approval now protect their boundaries like sacred ground. They've realized that the real freedom isn't in being single or taken, it's in being centered. And when you reach that point, love isn't something you need, it's something you choose. Peace gave men back their power, it gave them patience, it gave them presence, and it taught them something profound. That solitude isn't the absence of love, it's the space where real love begins. Section 6. The double standard. How modern culture turned against men. The moment men found peace, society called it a problem. When they chased success, they were told they worked too much. When they chased love, they were told they weren't ambitious enough. When they stopped chasing altogether, they were told they were bitter, broken, or afraid. It seems no matter what men do, it's wrong. If he speaks up, he's toxic. If he stays silent, he's emotionally unavailable. If he leads, he's controlling. If he follows, he's weak. The rules keep changing, but somehow the blame stays the same. Men who once gave everything, effort, loyalty, consistency, are now told those things are the bare minimum. Yet when they withdraw, suddenly the world asks, where have all the good men gone? They didn't vanish, they just stopped showing up where they weren't wanted. There's a quiet cruelty in how modern culture treats men. We cheer for women who set boundaries, but shame men who do the same. We celebrate women who say, I don't need a man, but ridicule men who say, I'm fine alone. It's not equality, it's hypocrisy, dressed as empowerment. And the saddest part, most men aren't even angry about it anymore. They've accepted it. They've learned to navigate the world without expecting fairness, because they understand something the culture doesn't. Peace doesn't need approval. You see it online every day. Endless jokes about men being useless, lazy, emotionless, disposable. They trend for laughs, for likes, for attention. But imagine if those same jokes were reversed, the world would erupt. Men have become the only group it's socially acceptable to mock. And yet they keep building, keep working, keep holding everything together quietly. But here's the irony. The more society tries to shame them, the stronger they get. You can't shame a man who's made peace with solitude. You can't manipulate someone who no longer needs validation. You can't control someone who isn't afraid to walk away. And that's exactly what's happening now. Men are walking away, not out of hatred, but out of clarity. They're tired of being told that being a man is a flaw. They're tired of hearing that masculinity is toxic, while the same traits, strength, discipline, protectiveness, are celebrated when women adopt them. They're tired of pretending they don't feel pain, tired of carrying the weight quietly while being mocked for the effort, and so they retreat, not to escape responsibility, but to reclaim dignity. They build new lives, simpler, smaller, quieter. They find meaning in purpose, not people. They measure worth in peace, not praise. And while the world calls them lonely, they call it liberation. Because the truth is, men aren't lonely in their solitude. They're lonely in relationships that make them invisible. They'd rather eat dinner alone in peace than sit next to someone who resents them. They'd rather sleep in an empty bed than lie next to someone scrolling through options. They'd rather face silence than face judgment. And for that, they get labelled damaged, detached, cold. But maybe they're not broken. Maybe they're finally healed. Because the man who learns to stand alone stops fearing anything. Rejection, disapproval, or abandonment. He's not avoiding love. He's avoiding pain disguised as it. And that's what the world can't stand. Men who no longer seek permission to be happy. They've stopped apologizing for wanting peace. They've stopped explaining why they walked away. And they've stopped waiting for understanding that will never come. Because they've realized something simple: you can't win a game that's rigged against you. So they stopped playing. And when they did, they finally started living. Section 7. The new reality. What men learned when they walked away. When men walked away, the world didn't notice at first. No one heard the silence when they stopped texting. No one saw the space they left behind in conversations, in relationships, in society. But slowly, people began to feel it. The dates stopped being planned. The favors stopped being offered. The late-night calls stopped being answered. It wasn't revenge, it was reality. Men weren't disappearing to make a point. They were disappearing to survive. And what they found on the other side wasn't loneliness, it was clarity. For the first time, they began to see who they really were. Stripped of obligation, stripped of noise, stripped of pretending. They discovered that peace doesn't come from being loved by someone else. It comes from finally liking the person in the mirror. They realized they could build a life worth living without waiting for permission. A life that didn't depend on being needed, or noticed, or chosen. Because the truth is, most men never wanted to be kings. They just wanted to be respected. They wanted their loyalty to mean something, their effort to matter, their love to be enough. But when the world told them that wasn't enough, they stopped asking for approval. They built their own kingdom, one made of discipline, silence, and purpose. You'll find them there now, in garages, turning wrenches, in gyms, lifting off the weight the world put on their shoulders, in small apartments, writing, reading, thinking, on long drives with music and quiet, instead of arguments and noise. They're not bitter, they're rebuilding. They've learned that peace doesn't need company, it just needs consistency. They've learned that validation fades, but self-respect lasts forever. They've learned that freedom isn't about escaping people, it's about escaping the version of yourself that was afraid to be alone. And now, they walk differently. They talk less. They react slower. They forgive quietly, not for others, but for themselves. Because the man who once begged for love now values peace too much to gamble it again. He's not cold. He's just careful. He's not detached. He's deliberate. He's not broken. He's built different now. And yes, there are women who see this, who understand it, who aren't threatened by his peace, but drawn to it. Because true feminine energy doesn't compete with calmness, it complements it. When that kind of woman meets that kind of man, the world stops spinning for a moment. No games, no battles, no ego, just understanding. Because both of them have lived through noise, and both of them are tired, and maybe, just maybe, this is what love will look like in the future. Not chaos disguised as passion, but quiet connection built on respect. Because when two people meet who've both found peace on their own, they don't complete each other, they protect each other. That's the kind of love men are open to now. Not the one that drains them, but the one that restores them. Not the one that asks for performance, but the one that honors presence. It's rare, it's quiet, but it's real. And until that love shows up, men are fine on their own. They're not angry, they're not hiding, they're just done trying to be everything for people who see them as nothing. This is the new reality. Men aren't rejecting women, They're rejecting a system that taught them their worth was conditional. They're rejecting manipulation disguised as empowerment. They're rejecting the idea that they must destroy themselves to be lovable. Because the truth is, a man who walks alone isn't lost. He's just walking a path nobody else is brave enough to take. And if you ask him whether he's lonely, he'll smile softly and say, "No, I'm at peace." Then he'll put his phone down, take a breath, and go back to building a life that no one can take from him. Because in the end, maybe happiness was never found in being chosen. Maybe it was found in choosing yourself.